self-help group called the Sewer Rehabilitation Contact Group, which has representatives from the UK's 12 regional sewer network owners and also from Irish Water in the Republic of Ireland. So in this webinar, I'm going to be reviewing the general response so far, identifying lessons learned and considering what next. It's in 4 parts: setting the scene, where we are, what's been learned about preparing for the pandemic, what's been learned about reacting to the pandemic, and some thoughts about what happens next with the recovery from the pandemic. Well, what happened with the Komnet Abwasser, perhaps typical of many organisations, we had a meeting. This in the picture is the last meeting before lockdown, and all subsequent meetings have been online. They focused on 3 things then. How was the disease and the virus transmitted? What role did water and sanitation play? And what do they need to worry about concerning occupational health and safety? And from that first meeting, they agreed 3 principles. They had to be very careful about the occupational safety for their staff, avoid unnecessarily risks, but concluded on the evidence available that if they applied the usual hygiene regulations that apply to working around sewage, then that should be sufficient for the moment. It was the last time they met together, as I said, and they then did 4 things subsequently. They regularly discussed and shared plans with each other of how they were coping with the pandemic. They made a decision to open up their discussions to other sewer network owners and also to publish information in English. So we did a series of 3 English language webinars to widen awareness. The members started sharing their documents online, and if you search for Komnet Abwasser, you will find, it's in German, you'll find the information they shared with each other, and IKT provided a help desk for them. Now, as I mentioned, fairly typical of actions taken by associations throughout the world to help their members. Initially, everybody was searching for the answers to how is this going to pan out? How does this virus behave? And it was the World Health Organization that, not surprisingly, emerged as the primary source of information. Also, the national bodies responsible for public health provided useful guidance. And as time has gone by, there's been a lot more information available, but during those initial stages, self-help was really the only way forward. So, if we look at the questions that have been asked over this year of trade associations by their water company members, in the early days they were mostly surrounding the transmission, the risk, and health and safety. Also, what to prioritize, what work could they give up, and what work should they continue with, how to organize their staff. And as regulatory requirements kept changing, a lot of questions out there about what this meant. By the middle of this year, the concern was more about availability of personal protective equipment. And then subsequently, it's been shifting, not surprisingly, towards impacts on revenue, what financial support is available to water utilities, and what's going to be the consequence for their operations in the future. Well, going back to what was initially known, the exact behavior of the SARS-CoV-2 virus was unknown, and to be honest, we're still discovering a lot of information about it. So all the initial deductions had to be based upon other coronaviruses and what was known. And so assumptions initially had to be made about the risks for water and sewage, and subsequently they proved correct. So that provides some reassurance that collectively we'll be able to respond quickly to the next pandemic when it comes along. Now, we looked around for guidance and advice, and actually one of the most comprehensive guides we found was a checklist that's been produced by the US Environment Protection Agency. It's their incident accident checklist for pandemic incidents, and that divided up the actions into 3 stages: preparing for the pandemic, responding to a pandemic, and recovering from it. So preparing, in a way, we're still ongoing because situations change and national regulations change. So those had to be thought through. But mostly what is happening at the moment is responding to the pandemic. We're not in a recovery phase yet. So when I say we're not in the recovery phase yet, we still really don't know how this is going to pan out. So we're in stage 2. We don't have vaccines commonly available yet. There is no cure, and further waves of infection are expected. Now, it wasn't known initially what it was going to look like. It appears, certainly from what was happening at the moment in the UK and Germany, that we're in this situation here. We're somewhere on the rise in a major winter spike, and we do not know going forward without intervention how this is going to turn out. So, looking at preparing for the pandemic, there's 5 actions here which summarize, and these are the principal actions again from that EPA document, what needs to be done. Planning the response, i.e. organising the teams, organising the staff, organising the way forward, ensuring employees are protected, maintaining essential operations. How are the essential operations going to be identified and continue to operate? What were the key facilities that had to be maintained? And how was the communication to be conducted for all of this, bearing in mind that there were all these restrictions moving in? And what's covered in the next slides applies equally to the water companies as it does to the supply chain, including the trenchless technology providers. Well, the typical planning actions: creating a team to lead the response, updating the response plans. Now, really, nobody's response plans, which existed, really anticipated exactly what was going to happen in terms of lockdowns, shutting downs of business, disruptions to the supply chain, and for many businesses, losing all of their income overnight. Reviews of information technology, the hardware, the software, how we're going to communicate, and also just ensuring how your staff are going to be able to continue to work under national regulations, for example, what counted as being essential services. Now, when it came to protecting employee health, you need to review your existing rules, ensure personal hygiene, ensure the supply of protective equipment, but particularly checking all the way through that the employees understood what they had to do. And for those who didn't have to be out there in public contact or working in the field, arranging home working and other social distancing measures became important. For us managing essential operations, it was a case of identifying what jobs needed to be staffed in order to keep the operations running. What were the critical activities that had to be undertaken? Also, who are the critical customers? The hospitals and other facilities that absolutely had to be kept online for supply of water and wastewater. And then finally, supporting all of that was finding alternative staff. So trawling through the staff in water companies and others who perhaps had past experience of running pumping systems or running a treatment works or a distribution network, who are perhaps now doing just jobs but might be available to be pulled back if needed. And when it came to the facilities, clearly there's pumps, tankers, valves, etc., which need to be maintained, but also what equipment was needed to maintain them, what supplies were needed. So there's a lot of activity, of course, as we know, around working with suppliers, developing the systems and finding alternative sources and creating stockpiles if necessary. So continuing with the theme of stage 1, the final element of that was the communication. So what needs to be communicated to customers and others, and how to set up those. And particularly, I think one of the main lessons that came out of this was a realization that perhaps traditional ways of raising revenue or collecting revenue from customers would have to change, and that online payment was perhaps going to have to be created as the new norm. Well, when we look at then about how there was a response to the pandemic, we've covered several of those items as well. So the plans are in place. So now it's all about protecting your employees' health, maintaining the operations and facilities, doing the communication. But there was also an important one, was actually recording what went on, particularly for those water companies that are in a heavy regulatory regime in terms of finance or environmental protection or performance in terms of customer complaints. They needed to really understand what happened so that they could subsequently argue the case with regulators if there were likely to be penalties for what had taken place. So this is the sort of stage where most of the sewer network operators are currently at. And when we look at a key issue that actually cropped up for many organizations was actually getting their staff recognized as being essential workers. And this wasn't recognized everywhere. So you have guys out trying to maintain water and sewer supplies getting stopped by the police. You get angry reactions from the public, seeing people working in the road saying, you're going to give us this disease, what are you doing here? And having to explain to them that actually it was essential that their water and their sewerage was maintained. And then in many cases as well, it was necessary to be an essential worker in order for staff to be able to work if there was childcare or free movement or even testing services available for essential workers only. So when it came to the protecting the health of staff, these are the sorts of things that were going on: outside team meetings for field staff, for office staff, one man per vehicle, or having two men on a vehicle, but keeping the vehicles separated and the team separated, so one lot went down with the disease, others wouldn't, and maintaining social distancing rules when working. In offices and in laboratories, the same thing, having to maintain the distance. And right down to a couple of pictures from IKT here, we were able to maintain some training, but reduced numbers of people and distance between them, and a very simple ruse here on the right to ensure that only one person was using the conveniences at a time. Now, keeping staff informed about the risks cropped up. Partway through the year, it was announced in the press that it was going to be possible to test for coronavirus in sewage because coronavirus had been found in sewage. Now, this caused consternation, and right across Europe, trade associations and others are having to deal with concerned staff and their families, saying, what's all this about coronavirus being in sewage? Unfortunately, what had happened was the initial press releases had not explained that it was just the genetic material found, not the live virus. And that caused quite a lot of trouble. Of course, I touched upon what happened with PPE. Nobody had enough, there were shortages, it was discovered the supply chain was fragile and that the existing reserves were not robust. So a lot of lessons learned there for future pandemics. Now, and really interesting development, of course, was home working. There were issues to start with, what hardware to use, what software to use, whether there are any human resource or health and safety issues. But actually, a lot of staff have discovered that they like working from home and were able to continue to work from home and do their roles. They had fewer interruptions. And actually, there are a number of studies out there which have shown that productivity and innovation actually can improve with people working from home. There's a reduction in office costs, but some equipment costs for equipping people to work from home. But the really big thing I think has come out of it is this online communication, surge in use. Now, the water sector is pretty conservative, and over the years, many people have been trying to say, let's communicate online rather than having to have endless meetings and traveling halfway across the country in order to have sales meetings and project meetings. But they've actually discovered, most water companies, that it works well. The communications are faster. There's also, for them, a pleasing reduction in costs for conducting meetings, for traveling, for training. So when we go back to the operations themselves, some water and sewage companies manage to maintain activities and some reduce them. It depends a lot on the national rules. Um, the things which are stopped tend to be the routine maintenance and investment works, including some sewer rehabilitation work. And what had to be maintained was urgent maintenance, blockages and collapses. So there were some trenchless technologies became important there. And there were design tasks which could be still undertaken, which were office-based. Now, looking particularly at contractors and what has happened there is that in some cases contractors haven't been able to work or they've had to reduce their active staff. But there's been a sort of a knock-on impact that's been felt with in terms of contractual arrangements, a sort of more flexibility on both sides, contractors and clients, better ways of dealing with deadlines, not applying financial penalties for delays, extensions to delivery times, consequences, financial and otherwise, of delays, more interruptions allowed or suspension of work. But there has been some postponement of tenders or offers during the period. Critical for the water and sewage companies themselves, though, is what's happened with their funding. Around the world, customers got mixed messages. So water companies have been instructed variously by governments not to increase charges or to reduce charges, to defer payments, or even make water free, and no mandatory reconnections. So there's been a reduced incentive for customers to pay. And then there have been changes to revenue. So commercial and industrial revenue dropped during closures, domestic revenue went up. If you are a water company in a city, no commuters, no tourists. In the rural areas, more domestic use from people staying at home, but less tourists. So different impacts felt in different places. And there's been this need for new methods of payment. So you can't have people visiting offices, making face-to-face payments. Cash payment became difficult. Access to banks has been difficult. And so new systems are needed with the online systems. Online banking, there's been a surprising increase in that throughout all around the world. And but of course, customers do need to be encouraged to pay. The impact has been interesting. The World Bank recently reported that a 10 to 40% reduction in revenues, and as high as 70 to 80% in case of some of the water companies that they were dealing with. So they've created spreadsheet tools. Latin American Bank has had a similar experience. And in Europe, the Acqua Pubblica Europa, which is a trade association dealing with publicly funded water and sewage companies, said their members have reported a 10 to 15% reduction in income. And as a consequence, having to stop part or all of investment. So what's the result of that has been that in many countries, the trade associations representing the sectors have been raising issues of financial support on behalf of their members. Public finances are going to be under strain for some years to come. So it's apparent that water and sewage companies are going to have to find ways of smarter ways of delivering their services for less money. And of course, trenchless technology has some advantages here. I've mentioned communication with regulators and keeping records. That's been a key as well, a lesson learned. So particularly if you've got activities that had to be stopped, you had to keep them informed, keeping them aware of issues. And that's another place where trade associations have been important, working on behalf of their members to raise such issues and deal with authorities collectively. So going on this theme of associations and what has happened there, with the current situation, it's really highlighted that associations have a role to play if there is a change in advice relating to transmission. They've got a really good job to play for their members in signposting changes in national regulation, lobbying government and regulators on behalf of members about public health, financial support, environmental regulation. And last but not least, providing access to experts who can give the advice that is needed. And what's been fundamental to that? Well, embracing of online communication, such as we're doing today. You can't hold face-to-face meetings. Online is likely to become the new normal. Working from home is now acceptable. You can now undertake meetings daily, weekly, or monthly. So in Germany, the Comnet Abwasser now meets every Friday. And in the UK, the Sewer Rehab Contact Group, which met 3 times a year, now meets every month online. But the converse side is that conference organisers are experiencing problems with events. So major events like the German IFAT exhibition should have taken place this year. It's now not going to take place until 2 years' time when otherwise expected. And in the UK STT, its annual No-Dig event was put back from September to next March, and it's now being put back from next March to June. And a major outcome, I think, is going to be we're going to see more automation and remote working on sewer networks. And this is where all companies have the opportunity to learn from each other nationally and internationally. There's going to be a lot of innovation and development, and basically water and sewage companies are going to be more receptive to new ideas. What next? This is the final slide. The situation's still evolving. The disruption is going to be long term. There's a lot more information and data that's going to emerge. So keeping an eye on what's going on internationally and nationally is going to be important. Creating or joining networks of organizations which can answer questions of mutual interest is probably the best way forward. That has really emerged from the lessons learned from this pandemic so far. And different countries are at different stages, so there's a lot to learn, therefore, from each other. So we talk of a new normal when this is over, after the pandemic. The new normal is already here. It's coping with the pandemic whilst having to make tough decisions about water industry investment and operations. And essentially, going forward, most water and sewerage companies are going to have to find new ways to continue to deliver their essential services for less money. And quite clearly, there is a role that trenchless technology can help with. So thank you for listening. Those are my contact details, and we'll be pleased to take questions. Thank you. This opportunity to speak about flowable backfill at this No-Dig conference. My name is Ian Naismith. I'm a senior research fellow at the Institute for Underground Infrastructure, which is based in Germany with offices in the Netherlands and in the UK, which is where I am based. We are an engineering research institute that undertakes work primarily for sewer network owners to evaluate issues that they have and identify solutions. So the talk I'm giving now is divided into 5 parts. I'm going to explain what we expect from flowable backfill material, explain the background to the evaluation that we undertook, how that was undertaken, what the results were, and what conclusions did we come to at the end, particularly with regard to quality assurance. So what is flowable backfill? Well, it is backfill that can be poured into a trench, will spread out, in theory self-level, surround pipes or other structures, and does not require compacting like normal backfill. But it is a mixture of materials. Natural soils or sands and gravels are brought in, or recycled materials can be used. You have binders, you have various add-ins like stabilizers, and its consistency is usually controlled by the amount of water that it contains. But what are its advantages? Well, it can be used in these hard-to-reach areas. So perhaps areas where it's difficult to get other normal compacting equipment into, because we're always interested in being able to properly support pipe work and underground utilities. It's particularly useful in sewer or pipeline construction as a consequence. Because it's flowable, the expectation is that it will self-compact and it will fill the available space without creating any cavities, without the need for mechanical compaction to ensure that. And in theory, it should be homogeneous, constant throughout in terms of its volume and stability. But particularly, what you want from a flowable backfill, which makes it different from flowable cements, foaming concretes, that type of thing, is that you can re-excavate it when you want to, and you should be able to re-excavate it easily, so you can get back down onto those utilities. We mentioned the homogeneous bedding of pipe. Now, one issue with conventional backfill is that it's difficult to get into the haunch areas underneath the pipe in order to properly support it. So with a flowable backfill, this should sort that issue out for itself. And it can be useful if you've got low coverage above, or if you've got other sort of the intricate arrangement that you get underground. It can flow in and around all of the structures that are there. We mentioned the no compaction device being required, so in theory you can have smaller working spaces, narrower trenches. As a consequence of no compaction, less vibration, reduced emissions, perhaps lower excavation costs with the narrower trenches. And it's adjustable. You can adjust the composition depending upon what you want in terms of how quickly you can walk on it, what sort of final strength you require, and the requirement for re-excavation. Because it sort of flows around with very little space or pores in between, it can provide protection against root intrusion and also against infiltration or exfiltration of water into or out of a pipe. And it can have properties in terms of being non-permeable to gas. However, it's a liquid. And so one of the things you have to be aware of is that if your pipes are empty, you may get buoyancy issues. So you have to use some form of buoyancy control. You need to consider the static calculations, because you're introducing this liquid into the trench, the interaction between it and the surrounding soil. And you may require lining of the narrow trench, and you need to be considering the fact that it's flowable, so it could leak into other spaces. So you have to be sure that there's nothing else it's going to go into where it shouldn't. So what it might look like at the end of the day: poured into a narrow trench, filling around the pipe, getting into small tight spaces between different utilities, and working quite well in odd shapes where it might be otherwise very difficult to get in and do your normal compaction. So what did we do with our evaluation? Its objectives, and the objectives of all of these evaluations we do, are to create market transparency, to reduce the investment risk for the sewer pipe owner who is wanting to commission the pipe and use this material. The project we undertook was funded by the Ministry for Environment in North Rhine-Westphalia, which is Germany's largest state, Länder, and also from a group of 13 German sewer network owners, and they formed the steering group for the project. And the steering group made all the decisions, advised by IKT, but they selected the products to be evaluated, the manufacturers to use, the suppliers, development of the test concept, and what kind of evaluation scheme was used. The outputs from this are 2 reports. There is first a report on this comparative exercise we undertook, and then there is going to be, which is already published and in the public domain, and then there is a wider project report which will be published looking at the wider issues surrounding this and the QA lessons that were drawn out from it. And what does it mean for the market? The consequence of this exercise is that the sewer network owners understand quality assurance issues. They can call for improvements on products or look for improvement in products, and they become informed customers or informed clients who know what to ask for. So how do we go about this evaluation? Well, we created in a large test pit that we have at IKT 5 identical pipe trenches. These were 3 meters wide, 3.5 meters deep, and 6 meters long. And in them we placed 2 manholes, a concrete and a plastic manhole. We had a sewer pipe running between them and various other pipes. Also, we were interested in shoring. The next slide explains how this worked, because we wanted to know what happened when we ripped the shoring out of the sides of the simulated trench and to see what happened to the flowable backfill. So what we created was these boxes either side, simulating a narrow trench with shoring that could be removed. We filled them with sand right up to behind the shoring in 2 cases, but we left a void in the others, as you might find in an uneven trench. We wanted to see what would happen when the flowable backfill moved into those voids when we removed them. And another view of the layout from above, just showing the pipe arrangements. We were interested in how it would flow around small arrangements of pipes, so we created a little box of pipes here. We had the main pipe, which is at the bottom, and then we had 2 more sewer pipes higher up. Also, there were some cross members which are supporting taking the weight between the 5 cells. There were 5 identical cells like this. And we needed an evaluation scheme, and this is what the sewer network owners came up with. Now, it's divided into performance checks, maximum score 85%, and quality assurance, which accounted for a further 15% of the overall score. And we divided it into 3 phases. So we looked at how the product performed during installation, during use, and then at the end, disposal. So we dug it up to see what would happen and looked at the material. On the quality assurance side, we looked at various aspects to do with the delivery notes, what monitoring was in place by the installers, what quality issues, quality marks they had, training, and we also looked for anything notable which occurred during the project that we weren't expecting. Now, we had a couple of knockout criteria, or KO, as opposed to OK, the KO criterion. So if it didn't flow properly, that would be a failure outright in the installation phase. If it doesn't become strong enough to be able to build over, i.e. put a road back on it, that would knock it out in the use phase. And we also needed to know whether it could be re-excavated easily and recycled. So that was how the overall scoring system operated. We selected products. Now, there were 16 relevant products available on the German market that were discovered. This is in the last couple of years. The project finished this year. We looked at what we wanted in terms of the composition of the material, the requirements set out by the steering group. It was important that it could be delivered within the state of North Rhine-Westphalia to our laboratory in Gelsenkirchen, where we were doing those tests, but we also had field sites where we had it poured into trenches, and we needed it to be delivered there, and it must have to be pumpable, because part of our large test rig is above ground, so it needed to be able to be pumped up over and into it. And we ended up with 5 products being selected that met all of those criteria, and that was felt to be representative, probably, of the 16 products available in Germany. So first of all, we did the installation phase. So we're looking here at flowability, how it could support pipes, what happened when we ripped that shoring out, how stable was it volume-wise, and the accessibility was how soon could you walk over it? And that scored variously scored, contributing 40% to the overall 85% for the performance checks. So with the flowability, the most basic test is done, as you might do with other types of flowable concretes, etc. It's spreadability. How wide does it spread when a certain amount is poured from a particular height? And we looked to see how that would function. And there were a range of issues as well to do with it. The consistency of the material, its stability. Self-leveling was interesting. We only poured the product in at one corner of the trench, and when it was finished, we looked to see, did it actually level across the whole trench, or was it higher at one side and lower at the other? Now, anything you see in green means that it was fine. Anything in yellow means that there were some issues with it. We scored up the points and we issue a grade. Now we use a grading system from 1 to 6. Grade 1 is excellent, down to grade 6, which is poor, or rather not usable. So you will see this throughout the presentation. We looked at the pipe support. So when we came to the excavation, we excavated down very carefully and we lifted out things like the shoring between, or the bracing. We lifted out the longitudinal pipes and we also lifted out the main sewer pipe to see what it would look like underneath. And these are the sorts of things we found. These are fine. We did find in some cases that there were small voids, but overall those were statically irrelevant. When we did the static calculations, they were not going to severely impact the support to the pipe. And we got a range of results again, but one product actually we found we couldn't excavate. It had set so hard we had to use mechanical equipment to break it up. And so we were not able to tell how well that had actually performed as we were breaking it out of the ground. But with the others, we had 2 which had absolutely no issues. We had a few small cavities and 1 or 2 others. So we've got scores between 1 and 2 for the other 4 products. When we pulled the shoring out, that was interesting. Now, we don't know when to pull it, so we asked the advice of the suppliers. How long do we leave it before we pull the shoring out? So it was more their decision, and we discovered we've got a range. We look to the right here. We have we've pulled it out, it's refilled, and we've got no cracking. But in 1 or 2 cases, we got a variety. We got cracks forming. This didn't go all the way to the bottom because when we excavated, we discovered it. But certainly up at the top here, a whole range of cracks or voids appearing. The result from pulling the shoring, again, fairly mixed results. 3 of them were very good. A couple of them had issues where that I showed you there, where we had the breaking up of the surface. It could have been that we were advised to pull the shoring too late. So that is something that has to be considered with this type of product. We looked at volume stability. So this is a product containing water. And so in these tubes, we looked to see what happened in terms of settlement and also the settling out of the water above. And we scored them again. And we've got a range of scores from 1 to 2 here. Accessibility was this question of walkover. So we used some weights, and we were looking at the requirement was that it should be at least after 12 hours. We got one product that could be walked over within 3.9 hours. One which took 30 hours, which scored a 6. This one here, 23 hours, scored a 5. Well beyond what we were looking for. So going to the use phase, we looked at the ability to build over. That was one of the failure criteria. So then we used a static load plate to look at what level of support it was able to produce. Now, it's after 28 days. This is a sort of a fixed time, but obviously in many cases it would have been possible to build over earlier than that. We had one product that took 56 days, and after 56 days it still wasn't properly supporting. Others, we had a 7-day value here. And we also looked at risk of subsidence. So we're looking at where does it shrink over time. So we did these initial volume stability, but we also then did some longer term exercises in pots where we were looking to see how it shrunk and whether we had issues of subsidence risk. But that was not an issue in most cases. Looking at the tree roots, when you have tree roots growing in or near a pipe, is usually because it is following the path of least resistance. So a series of cracks on the surface here would allow tree roots into this structure, but as we discovered, it didn't go all the way through to the bottom. Also here around the sides of a couple of sides of the manholes. We're seeing a bit of shrinkage. And we also got odd little bits of shrinkage or cracks around the edge of shoring, which would be roots for roots to get through. We did do some experiments in pots with ordinary soil and pots containing the liquid fill, and we did in one case have some evidence of roots managing to get through the liquid soil, but in most cases they couldn't. So again, a range of scores were achieved from the different planting trials. When it came to disposal, we did have some issues. The steering group members went in with spades. This is them trying to dig into the surface of one of the soils, which they couldn't do. We ended up having to get the contractor in with digging gear to cut it out, and it was not successful as a consequence. So with re-excavatability, we actually had 2 products which proved very difficult to excavate, and 3, only one which was really excavatable, but the other 2 weren't too bad. With recycling, that again was interesting. We had to look at the recyclability and using a scoring system in Germany, which is based upon acceptance in landfill sites. We did have one product which would not have been acceptable in a landfill because of its chemical composition. And then when we moved on to look at the quality assurance, we found a range of results there, ranging from no issues, which shown in green here, to some minor issues to do with training, etc. But under conspicuous features, one product, they didn't deliver enough material. They had to go back and get some more, so we didn't get what we had originally asked for. There was some issue with the calculation of how much material was delivered to site. One product as well, they ended up adding some water when they got on site in order to make it flow better, and then we discovered that the warranty was invalidated because water had been added on site. And one product, we had an issue when excavating it of the smell of ammonia, which exceeded the acceptable limits, and we ended up having to use gas masks for the staff when they were excavating. So the overall scores that we got from these products, bearing in mind this is the overall score, and it's rated upon 85% for the performance and 15% for the quality assurance. So we had a couple of goods, one unsatisfactory, which was the reason it was marked down was because it was a bit difficult to re-excavate, and we had 2 that turned out to be inadequate. One because it was more or less solid when we tried to re-excavate it, and we had the one which had a number of issues to do with particularly the recycling and disposal. So if you remember, we had these knockout criteria that if you failed them, that meant that it wasn't acceptable in that formulation. So what were our conclusions? We found large differences in quality, as you can see. But we did discover that the various advantages of flowable backfill could be achieved in terms of pipe support, flowability, and re-excavatability. Generally, it was calculated they could be built over after 7 days, and it may obviously be less. You could do more calculations possible. We realized that the knockout criteria that had been identified by our steering group were the ones that people should be looking out for. And it was realized that a lot of the issues that were discovered, the one that wouldn't excavate and the one that had various issues to do with its recyclability, were down to the management or the quality assurance of the mixing plant and the materials that were used. So that is something which is normally out of your control, and you've got to rely on good QA by the supplier. There is a real conflict, if you like, between re-excavatability and being able to walk over or build over quickly. So that is down to the formulation, the mixing, and that needs to be carefully taken into account. We discovered that when you pull the shoring out, you can get disturbance, and that is a bit of an art getting that right and knowing when to remove the shoring. So that's based upon experience. And quite clearly, there is a requirement for quality assurance and supervision on the construction site. We realised as well in Germany there were very few suppliers that could supply across the whole of Germany, so it tends to be more a sort of a local supply is the way in which this market works. And to finish with, I mentioned that there is a report which is publicly available on the website. You can find it again through our IKT website or using this link. There will be a full report out in due course, and there's contact details at the bottom here for emails from myself and Dr. Mark Klamath, who was the project manager for this. So thank you very much for this opportunity to present this, and we now go into questions. For the NoDig conference. My name is Ian Naismith. I'm a senior research fellow with IKT, the Institute for Underground Infrastructure, which is based in Germany with offices in the Netherlands and the UK, which is where I am based. We are an independent, not-for-profit research institute, and everything we do is undertaken on behalf of sewer network owners to help them address issues that they have and come up with solutions. So why are we presenting today on the subject of manhole rehab? Well, it started really 2 decades ago when German sewer network owners first were becoming aware that there were products available to help them rehab sewers, particularly in relation to issues concerning preventing infiltration. We did a little more work on something else that was of interest to them, which was odor control products that could be put beneath manhole lids in order to stop smells getting out. But then our main research was undertaken from 2012 to 2016, culminating in a major study comparing the performance of different technologies that were available. And since then, we've been doing quality assurance field studies involving hundreds of manholes in the Netherlands and Germany, and running training on 2 to 5 day training courses. So what I'm going to talk about are 3 things: setting the scene of what happens with sewer manholes in terms of their primary and secondary functions, and then how we went about comparing the performance of rehab techniques, and finishing with some of the lessons that we learned. Well, what about sewer manholes? They are more than just a manhole cover, of course, which is what most people see. Down the shaft, they're actually possibly the poor relation of the sewers themselves. A lot of effort goes into keeping the sewers flowing, not so much effort into managing the condition of the manholes, although the obvious thing is often a failure of the rungs which allow access, and you can see in this case they've been removed. Well, primary function is the relief of pressure internally, and of course when this is happening this can cause damage to the interior of a manhole shaft. And another primary function is the accessibility, obviously for people and equipment to get in. So climbing technologies and equipment to stop falls and encourage occupational safety are important, as is concern for atmospheric measures relating to dangerous gases. And another third of the primary functions is ventilation, so allowing oxygen to get in, and unfortunately though, of course, that does result in odor nuisance. There are a number of secondary functions. Of course, as a shaft, as a structure which is part of the sewer network, a manhole should not allow infiltration. And if you get uncontrolled water ingress, this can often result, for example, in the overloading of sewage treatment works, where too much volume of water is being received by them during periods when the groundwater table is high. And conversely, you can get exfiltration of sewage into aquifers as a result of damage to sewers. You've got to remember that apart from the chamber, you've got the seals which connect into the water supply, the pipes going in and out of the manhole. So another secondary function, it has to resist loads from above, from below, and from the sides, from the surrounding soil, etc., in order to correctly function. So any rehab does need to take that into consideration. And a final secondary function is there is a road safety issue, of course, with the manholes on the top. So what did we do about comparing the performance of rehab techniques? Well, the sewer network owners had started to realize that although they had these techniques available, various linings, they weren't always functioning properly. So they wanted to know which ones are suitable, what have they got to look for. And the exercise we undertook, which is an IKT compare or comparative project, was to look at, can you permanently make a manhole watertight by using a rehab technique? And they wanted to know what were the strengths and the weaknesses of the technologies that are available, what quality to expect, what issues to look for. We were required to undertake a one-to-one scale evaluation. And the whole project was funded by the Ministry of the Environment for North Rhine-Westphalia, which is the largest of the German landers, and a group of 17 of the cities which own the sewer networks, who formed the project steering group. Now, we have a procedure that we follow with these comparative projects. We've done them for sewers, lateral connections, lateral sewers, the manholes, flowable backfill, a whole range of products. And we always start by working with the sewer network owners to understand exactly what the problem is that needs to be resolved. So we looked at the real situation in the field, and that involved going out with the members of the steering group and looking at their manholes and working out with them what's the actual problem they want to resolve and what are the causes. Something that also became clear was that there are many different types of materials used for manhole shafts. So we've got here concrete and masonry, a range of plastics, stoneware, and some combinations. And what was realized was that in Germany, the majority of manhole shafts are concrete. Then it's masonry and relatively little plastic. That's relatively new, the concept of using a plastic manhole shaft. So it was decided by the steering group the focus would be on concrete shafts. And we then undertook a market survey of standards, but also the available solutions, available technologies. What was out there that was available to them to undertake rehab and that needed to be compared. So we came up here with, essentially they fell into three technologies: mortar coatings applied to the inner surface of the manhole rings, plastic coatings, which could be sprayed on, for example, or applied in various ways, and then linings. These are more physical linings where you are bolting together or inserting something which is creating a new chamber within a chamber. And there were a number of representative products within each one of these technologies. So we were comparing technologies using a selection of representative products. So for the 1-to-1 scale rig, we use the large test pit at IKT. This is 15 meters long, 6 meters wide, and 6 meters deep. And we built a number of manhole chambers or shafts using new materials, but with simulated damage patterns. Once these were built up and the whole pit was filled with sand, it looked like this. And when the suppliers of the rehab techniques came to do their rehabilitation, this is what they saw, and they had a proper manhole to work through. A couple of extra things to point out in this photograph, which are typical of the projects we do. We do undertake a bit of research as well. So there were a couple of rectangular shafts were introduced as well at the request of a Dutch participant in the project, because they wanted to see how the spinning spray heads worked in terms of getting an even spread into a rectangular shape rather than a round manhole. And also, I mentioned before plastic manholes. Well, there was an interest in, do these things float? If we fill this with water, because we have the ability to fill this sand-filled chamber up with water to simulate groundwater, did the plastic manhole float as a consequence? Well, having decided upon what the 1-to-1 scale evaluation would be like, we had to come up with a scoring system. And what happens in most of these exercises we do, we score according to performance, but also quality assurance. What sort of QA systems were in place by these suppliers. So in this case, the performance or system tests were given a weighting of 85% and the QA 15%. And looking down with the system tests, water tightness was considered to be the most important, so that scored 40%. The load bearing strength of the product, 20%. The robustness of the system, 20%, and acceptance. Now, this acceptance impression was actually because the steering group members had commissioned the work. They wanted to have a bit of a final say in whether they accepted what had been done. So this was based upon their impression when they saw the completed products. On the QA side, we look at a range of things: the installation manual and procedures. If it's followed, does it mean you can do a proper installation? And the technical data sheets for the products that we've been used. We want to know whether the contractor staff had been trained and what sort of training was available to people who use this equipment and materials, and whether there were test certificates available, and what sort of external monitoring or monitoring program did the contractor have in place to ensure that what they installed was done correctly. And finally, we look out for anything conspicuous. So if there's anything that occurs during the evaluation that was not anticipated in advance but is considered to be significant, that gets a mention as well. So the test setup, here's looking in a sort of a cross-section through it. We have a number of chambers that were created, and we have the ability to fill the entire test pit with water. So we can bring it right up to near surface level to simulate rising and falling groundwater. Now, I mentioned that we put in some artificial damage, and in conjunction with the sewer network owners, it was decided that there would be a series of holes. There would be a series of damaged ring joints where the rings that make up the manhole shaft were stacked upon each other. Some more extensive patches of damage with multiple holes. And also, because there was a particular interest, how do these products perform if the substrate behind has not been properly prepared? These are particularly for the ones which rely on adhesion to the wall of the manhole. We put on a mold release agent, which would mean effectively the product wouldn't stick. And these were just done deliberately to see what would happen. It's part of the experimental side of this exercise. So we selected these products, or rather the steering group selected them. And something to bear in mind is that when we do these projects, we invite the suppliers in to see the experimental setup and comment on it. If they say, actually, what you're asking us to do is something our product cannot do, we accept that. And it may be that they decide to continue anyway, but we don't include that in the evaluation because they've declared that they can't fix that, but it may be done for experimental purposes. So they get a chance to comment on it, and we take that into account when we are devising the final experiment. But the other thing is they're given a tender document and they are paid. Just like it would be a normal installation, they are paid to come and install into the manhole chambers. And if they decline or they don't want to take part, that was also recorded and included in the project report as the reasons why they didn't want to be part of it. So they came and did their installations, and we observed the installations, what quality control was involved, and it also gives some indication of costs, manpower, and the relative amount of time involved for using different techniques. The evaluation, having done the installation, I mentioned we can bring the groundwater up and down, was that we looked at the initial state, what was the product like, and how did it perform with no groundwater pressure when first installation. We then did a filling exercise in steps from 1 up to the full 5 meters, and looked a short-term exposure to heavy groundwater at a depth of 5 meters to see how they performed at that point. They were then subjected to a 2-month period of that high groundwater and evaluated again. At one point, the contractors were invited in. If there was some small damage which was visible, they were given the opportunity to fix that, so we could see how their repair might perform, the sort of thing that might be required after an acceptance evaluation. And then at the end, the water level was lowered, and we looked at the overall situation with those products. Now, in terms of when we were doing these evaluations, we looked at a whole range of aspects. So we had optical condition, so cracks, holes, color differences, the types of things you could easily see. An acoustic evaluation, tapping, listening for hollows, etc. A haptical evaluation, which was looking really at surface roughness, sanding, scratch resistance of the material. We did look at odor, because essentially if these things smell really badly and that smell is going to transfer out of the manhole and cause upset for the public, then, or be an issue for, let's say, for health and safety, that had to be considered. And as I was saying, overall, we were looking to see if there was physical leakage visible. We did adhesion tests to see if they would pull out, and we also did some wall stiffness tests using something called the MAC extensiometer. Sort of things we found. So here's the mortar linings, damp patches, cracking, issues around the footsteps. That was a particular thing we were interested in, as to how these products could cope with the ladder arrangement or the step arrangement within a manhole, and actual leaks. And if we look again at the plastic, we had one system that failed. It actually came away from the wall and bowed out under water pressure, so it was impossible to actually get down to the bottom of the manhole. This was essentially unsafe. We got the small leaks, we got bulges, and again we did find some issues around how they could cope with the steps. Again, this is the sort of thing that might require going back to have some further work done at a later date. And I mentioned a number of other tests. We did the pull-out test using devices to check the adhesion to the side for those systems that relied upon bonding to the wall of the sewer pipe. And this extensiometer applies pressure, and we can monitor movement to see what sort of strength is created by the lining system. I mentioned the project steering group had a say. They went down into each one of the manholes, they had a look themselves, and they were able to comment on anything that they felt would be of concern for them if they were accepting this as a completed project. We also, because we like to check what we see in the lab when they do an installation, is that the same as for real? We will go out and look at real installations of the same products. Well, the results are tabulated, and you can there's some links at the end to show you where you can get hold of these. We score the system test, the performance, and the quality assurance, and there's a lot of other information. Too much detail in here for me to explain, other than to say that we score from 1 to 6. 1 is good, 6 is bad, and we had a range of good to satisfactory here. And on the second page, we got down to one which is barely sort of sufficient or adequate, and down into not evaluatable. That was the one that failed. So what lessons did we learn from this? So first of all, we did learn that you can get reliable rehabilitation of a manhole shaft against groundwater pressure from these systems. Not all of them, but there are systems out there which will work in that way. We had a range from very good down to adequate. What was very clear was that in most cases where we did see a problem, it was deficiencies in substrate preparation. This was in the field, but also with those simulations we did. So if you don't have good preparation of the substrate and the material can't bond, then you may be it will result in problems. We also found that if there are problems, they will appear immediately. What we tended to find was that when we raised the water table, we would see damages appearing, and they might get worse over time. But what we tended not to see over time was anything new appearing. So that has lessons for inspection. So what we recommend is, on acceptance, a product is inspected when the groundwater level is high. So it might have to wait to a wet season to do a formal inspection. The load-bearing capacity using that MAC system varied quite widely. And we got a whole range of things from relatively deficient to excellent. We found in some cases there was no structural analysis certificate that could be provided for the product, so we didn't really know what the load-bearing safety information was for it. And in fact, quality assurance tended to be very patchy. And the majority of the system suppliers, they weren't able to provide training certificates or testing certificates or approvals. So there were some issues there. And we did do this MAC extensiometer with some sort of crack rings to see what would happen. We got a range of overall stiffness. We found the plastic coatings that the stiffness was a bit lower, but a combination of the plastic with what was left of the surrounding rings did return the original stiffness of the concrete. And the final sort of overall, once again to say, is poor substrate preparation that we believe would be the thing that was most likely to let down a system like this. So that ends the presentation. There's a summary article available in English, and there are full reports available in German online. IKT, we publish all of the work we do in the public domain, so you can find it there. There's a couple of websites, and there are the contact details for myself and Marcus Gillar, who is the project manager. So thank you very much for this opportunity to make the presentation, and I think it is over to questions now. Hello, and thank you for the invitation to make this presentation on the rehabilitation of sewer manholes for the NoDig conference. My name is Ian Naismith. I'm a Senior Research Fellow with IKT, the Institute for Underground Infrastructure.
Up above the world so high and down on the grounds, The advancements that you see in India's aviation is the success saga of the excellence shown by Airports Authority of India. AAI is constructing, operating and maintaining world-class airport. Along with that, AAI has a side that's down to earth and close to the people. One that's clearly visible in its CSR programs and activities. Through its CSR activities, AAI has keenly focused on skill development. To generate livelihood opportunities in backward and remote areas, AAI has tied up with Construction Industry Development Council for skill development of unemployed youth and people belonging to economically weaker sections.
In construction industry, there is a acute shortage of skilled manpower. At the same time, there is a unemployed youth. So if we provide them a skill, it will be a win-win situation for both.
Through this skill development training, the student get theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge in construction-related subjects like land survey, electrical wireman, general work supervisor, site accountant and storekeeper, etc.
Actually, here we are providing trainings to the unskilled youth of India who are unemployed. We distribute pamphlets at the different locations of UP, Bihar, West Bengal to get the unskilled manpower. Then we can make them skilled. So we are providing them 3 months training.
More than 5,000 students have been trained with this skill development training program since 2015.
जब मैं यहाँ पे आया था तो इस सब्जेक्ट से रिलेटेड मेरे पास कुछ ज़्यादा नॉलेज नहीं थी, लेकिन यहाँ आने के बाद इस फील्ड में मुझे काफ़ी नॉलेज मिली है।
हमारे 2 महीने हो गए ट्रेनिंग के और 1 महीना बाकी रहा, मतलब काफ़ी कुछ सीख लिया 2 महीने के अंदर।
यहाँ से मतलब सीख के जाएंगे तो हम दुकान खोल सकते हैं अपने घर पे जाके, मतलब हम अपना कोई भी बिजनेस फैला सकते हैं।
ये बहुत अच्छी अपॉर्चुनिटी दे रहा है एयरपोर्ट और CIDC, जिससे कि बच्चे अपना आगे का फ्यूचर बना सकें।
With this skill development training, AAI has generated employment for many of underprivileged and uneducated youth. And on the other side, AAI and other PSUs got a skilled worker for their construction sites.
ट्रेनिंग से हमको मतलब बहुत लाभ हुआ है। मैं आज यहाँ पे जॉब पे हूँ और मेरा काम यहाँ पे जो है प्लांट को चलाने का है। मतलब जो बाहर से ऑर्डर आता है कंक्रीट का, मैं डिस्पैच स्लिप से उसे यहाँ से बना के मतलब माल को बनवा के और वहाँ पे साइट पे भेजना होता है हमको।
पहले मुझे कंप्यूटर की बिल्कुल भी नॉलेज नहीं थी, फिर धीरे धीरे मैं 3 महीने में इतना सीख गई कि वो लोग मेरा कॉन्फिडेंस देख के मुझे यहाँ पे एम्प्लॉय रख लिए।
Our motto by doing all CSR activity in Airports Authority of India is to make the difference and feel the difference.
Airports Authority of India has come to lend a new and distinct prominence to India on global aviation map. And we share this pride with every Indian. And we shall continue to serve them and enrich lives of Indians everywhere.
सेंटर में फूड प्रिजर्वेशन का ट्रेनिंग ले रही हूँ। यहाँ पे हम प्रैक्टिकल कर रही हूँ। यहाँ पे हमें अचार बनाना, जाम बनाना, जेली बनाना आदि सिखाया गया है और उसके साथ यहाँ पे मार्केटिंग और पैकेजिंग की भी सिखाया गया है। हम जॉब कर सकते हैं या जॉब नहीं भी करें तो उसके द्वारा हम अपना बिजनेस शुरू कर सकते हैं। इसीलिए मैं CIDC और AAI को धन्यवाद देना चाहती हूँ। वो हमें ये सिखाया कि हमें अपने पैरों पर खुद खड़ा होना सिखाया। इसलिए थैंक यू।
मैं CIDC में ट्रेनिंग करने के लिए आया हूँ, जो कि मिनिस्टर ब्रह्मो इंजीनियरिंग कॉलेज में कराया जा रहा है, जो कि कोकराझार डिस्ट्रिक्ट में है, असम में। मैं जो ट्रेड लिया हुआ हूँ वो है जनरल वर्क सुपरवाइजर का।
ऑटो लेवल एक डिवाइस होता है जिसके जरिए लेवल ज़मीन का और दूसरी चीज़ों का लेवलिंग लिया जाता है। इस डिवाइस के मुख्य पार्ट्स हैं ये ट्राइपॉड स्टैंड में ये ट्राइपॉड स्क्रू होता है जिसके ज़रिए इसका हाइट एडजस्ट किया जाता है और हाइट के साथ साथ इसका लेवल भी एडजस्ट किया जाता है।
I belongs from Risu, Meghalaya. I first 10 class. My father is a farmer. He earns just rupees 300 daily for family. That is not sufficient. I heard about my son training. Started at District Para by CIDC. I got admission and learning a lot about house construction. I learned about foundation, cement, sand, etc. By taking this training, I can make my future is better way. Thanks a lot to CIDC.
आफ्टर 10 पास में बेरोजगार था तो मेरा दोस्त राज ने बताया CIDC के बारे में और मैं CIDC सेंटर गोलाघाट ट्रेड प्लम्बर में ज्वाइन किया।
हम लोग गांव में कोई भी काम नहीं मिला, इसलिए हम लोग जो सेंटर से हम लोग को बोला, इसलिए वो लोग दिल्ली से सब लोग आया और CIDC बेलपारा में अच्छा काम करना मिलेगा बोला, इसलिए हम लोग ट्रेनिंग के लिए CIDC के आया और हम लोग ये CIDC ट्रेनिंग खत्म होने के बाद हम अच्छा काम चुनेगा।
यहाँ मैं सिगोली CIDC सेंटर में फूड प्रिजर्वेशन में ट्रेड पे हम लोगों को आम के आसार, जाम, स्क्वायर बनाना सिखा रही है। तो यहाँ पे हम लोग यह बेल के स्क्वायर बना रही हूँ। तो ये सीखने के बाद हम लोग पैकेजिंग और मार्केटिंग भी सीखेंगे और सीख भी रही हूँ। और ये इसके लिए हमें तो फ्री में CIDC और AI हमें तो फ्री में ट्रेनिंग दे रही है। इसके लिए हम CIDC को और AAI को थैंक यू बोलना चाहते हूँ जो हम लोगों को फ्री में ट्रेनिंग दे रहे हैं। और मैं खुद ये सीखने के बाद मैं खुद के बिजनेस शुरू करूँगी, अगर मुझसे हो सके तो मैं जॉब भी करना चाहूँगी।
My father is a teacher. I'm taking training in Muslim Trade at Nongstoin Center. I have learned about the construction material, measurement, the foundation, brick, masonry, extra from Pawan, from Sir Pawan. After training, I can work this trade and earn my living.
हम लोग अभी पहले तो हम लोग 200 रुपया ऐसा मांगेगा। अभी हम लोग CIDC ट्रेनिंग लेने के बाद हम लोग जो काम उसको हम लोग सीखेगा, उसको हम लोग अभी 500, 600, 700 ऐसा मांगेगा।
मैं आसाम से आई हूँ, मेरा डिस्ट्रिक्ट गोलाघाट। मैं पहले से गोलाघाट इंजीनियरिंग कॉलेज में CIDC पार्ट की सब्जेक्ट फूड प्रिजर्वेशन के लिए 3 मंथ की कोचिंग करने के लिए आई थी। वहाँ मैंने फूड प्रिजर्वेशन क्या है वो सीखा है। तो वहाँ पर मैंने सिडोली सेंटर में ट्रांसफ़र की गई है। यहाँ पहला दिन से मैं आसार, जैम, जेली कैसे बनाती है वो सब सीखा है। और उसके बाद मैंने मार्केटिंग और पैकेजिंग भी बहुत सारी बातें सीखने के मिले हैं। तो इसीलिए मैं जो भी जॉब और ना तो मैं अपनी बिजनेस शुरू करना चाहती हूँ।
Up above the world so high and down on the grounds, the advancements that you see in India's aviation is the success saga of the excellence shown by Airports Authority of India. AAI is constructing, operating and maintaining world-class airport. Along with that, AAI has a side that's down to earth and close to the people. One that's clearly visible in its CSR programs and activities. Through its CSR activities, AAI has keenly focused on skill development. To generate livelihood opportunities in backward and remote areas, AAI has tied up with Construction Industry Development Council for skill development of unemployed youth and people belonging to economically weaker sections.
In construction industry, there is a acute shortage of skilled manpower. At the same time, there is a unemployed youth. So if we provide them a skill, it will be a win-win situation for both.
Through this skill development training, the student get theoretical knowledge and practical knowledge in construction-related subjects like land survey, electrical wireman, general work supervisor, site accountant and storekeeper, etc.
Actually, here we are providing trainings to the unskilled youth of India who are unemployed. We distribute pamphlets at the different locations of UP, Bihar, West Bengal to get the unskilled manpower. Then we can make them skilled. So we are providing them 3 months training.
More than 5,000 students have been trained with this skill development training program since 2015.
जब मैं यहाँ पे आया था तो इस सब्जेक्ट से रिलेटेड मेरे पास कुछ ज़्यादा नॉलेज नहीं थी, लेकिन यहाँ आने के बाद इस फील्ड में मुझे काफ़ी नॉलेज मिली है।
हमारे 2 महीने हो गए ट्रेनिंग के और 1 महीना बाकी रहा, मतलब काफ़ी कुछ सीख लिया 2 महीने के अंदर।
यहाँ से मतलब सीख के जाएंगे तो हम दुकान खोल सकते हैं अपने घर पे जाके, मतलब हम अपना कोई भी बिजनेस फैला सकते हैं।
ये बहुत अच्छी अपॉर्चुनिटी दे रहा है एयरपोर्ट और CIDC, जिससे कि बच्चे अपना आगे का फ्यूचर बना सकें।
With this skill development training, AAI has generated employment for many of underprivileged and uneducated youth. And on the other side, AAI and other PSUs got a skilled worker for their construction sites.
ट्रेनिंग से हमको मतलब बहुत लाभ हुआ है। मैं आज यहाँ पे जॉब पे हूँ और मेरा काम यहाँ पे जो है प्लांट को चलाने का है, मतलब जो बाहर से ऑर्डर आता है कंक्रीट का, मैं डिस्पैच स्लिप से उसे यहाँ से बना के मतलब माल को बनवा के और वहाँ पे साइट पे भेजना होता है हमको।
पहले मुझे कंप्यूटर की बिल्कुल भी नॉलेज नहीं थी, फिर धीरे धीरे मैं 3 महीने में इतना सीख गई कि वो लोग मेरा कॉन्फिडेंस देख के मुझे यहाँ पे एम्प्लॉय रख लिए।
Our motto by doing all CSR activity in Airports Authority of India is to make the difference and feel the difference.
Airports Authority of India has come to lend a new and distinct prominence to India on global aviation map. And we share this pride with every Indian. And we shall continue to serve them and enrich lives of Indians everywhere.
सेंटर में फूड प्रिजर्वेशन का ट्रेनिंग ले रही हूँ। यहाँ पे हम प्रैक्टिकल कर रही हूँ। यहाँ पे हमें अचार बनाना, जाम बनाना, जेली बनाना आदि सिखाया गया है और उसके साथ यहाँ पे मार्केटिंग और पैकेजिंग की भी सिखाया गया है। हम जॉब कर सकते हैं या जॉब नहीं भी करें तो उसके द्वारा हम अपना बिजनेस शुरू कर सकते हैं। इसीलिए मैं CIDC और AAI को धन्यवाद देना चाहती हूँ। वो हमें ये सिखाया कि हमें अपने पैरों पर खुद खड़ा होना सिखाया। इसलिए थैंक यू।
मैं CIDC में ट्रेनिंग करने के लिए आया हूँ, जो कि बिनेश्वर ब्रह्मो इंजीनियरिंग कॉलेज में कराया जा रहा है, जो कि कोकराझार डिस्ट्रिक्ट में है, असम में। मैं जो ट्रेड लिया हुआ हूँ वो है जनरल वर्क सुपरवाइजर का।
ऑटो लेवल एक डिवाइस होता है जिसके जरिए लेवल ज़मीन का और दूसरी चीज़ों का लेवलिंग लिया जाता है। इस डिवाइस के मुख्य पार्ट्स है ये ट्राइपॉड स्टैंड में ये ट्राइपॉड स्क्रू होता है जिसके ज़रिए इसका हाइट एडजस्ट किया जाता है और हाइट के साथ साथ इसका लेवल भी एडजस्ट किया जाता है।
I belongs from Risu, Meghalaya. I first 10 class. My father is a farmer. He earns just rupees 300 daily for family. There is not sufficient. I heard about my son training. Started at Risu Velfara by CIDC. I got admission and learning a lot about house construction. I learned about foundation, cement, sand, etc. By taking this training, I can make my future is better way. Thanks a lot to CIDC.
आफ्टर 10 पास में बेरोजगार था तो मेरा दोस्त राज ने बताया CIDC के बारे में और मैं CIDC सेंटर गोलाघाट ट्रेड प्लम्बर में ज्वाइन किया।
हम लोग गांव में कोई भी काम नहीं मिला, इसलिए हम लोग जो सेंटर से हम लोग को बोला, इसलिए वो लोग दिल्ली से सब लोग आया और ऋषि वेलफेयर में अच्छा काम करना मिलेगा बोला, इसलिए हम लोग ट्रेनिंग के लिए CIDC के आया और